Hello, welcome to this video, and in this video I would like to communicate to you all some of the conclusions that I've come to after doing my epic 7-part series on the history of progressive rock or prog in 60 albums. When I was creating that video I was much more focused on thinking not even decade to decade but almost year to year, you know, looking at a single year, picking out one album and trying to use that album to point to a little step forward that happened in that year. And so even though I was trying to see the bigger picture, it's very difficult to, and I've got to be honest, I think when I started on that history I had an idea of what the big picture was, and then when you actually do it and you go through it year by year, you then come to some conclusions. Of course, as the videos come out, then people start to put in comments, and some of the comments are really interesting and perceptive. There's people who watch this channel who really know about their music history, and they can bring in so many different aspects to it that make you think. There's also a contingent of people that are obviously sat there waiting for me to read out their favourite band, and so I've had to argue why I went for certain things and not other things, and I had to really consider whether I made the right decision in picking that album. And in some cases over, you know, which is pretty much 50 years and 60 albums, I got it wrong, you know. So these things are personal, it is my viewpoint. So I've been reading the comments every night, you know, I've been going through, watching the videos again, and I've come to some conclusions. So what I thought would be nice would be to do a video here where I sort of communicate, you know, my sort of gestalt big picture that I now have in my head about prog. Right? I started off the series by trying to define prog so that I could sort of, you know, explain the inclusions of certain things, because I tried to weave a line where I covered stuff which was definitely in the prog genre, and also at the same time show what's going on outside of the prog genre but where acts are being progressive. You know, that was something that at the beginning of prog history those two things are together, and I think this could well be it's the thing that causes all the consternation between prog fans, you know. And there is a split. There are those who see any music that's pushing the boundaries as being progressive. There's other people that think that prog is a genre and it has to do certain things to be in that genre and has to sound a certain way, in the same way that you would belong to a heavy metal genre or reggae genre. Now, at the beginning of progressive rock in the mid-60s, right, what we have is rock music, which has come out of popular music, has suddenly been made intelligent. And there's this idea which chimes in with the times that rock music is not only popular music but is artistically as valid as classical music or high art. That first starts with the integration of different styles of music allied with a change in lyrical matter. And I think, you know, Bob Dylan's the musician that really does this. He comes in and he makes songwriting serious, and suddenly people can, and you know, they can get an emotional, political response to popular music. And this then blows everything open, and everybody thinks, well, what else can we do? What can we combine with? How can we push the barriers? And so people go, oh my, look at all these pop bands. They're taking pop music and they're progressing it. There's this thing called progressive rock. Of course, right at the start, progressive rock is describing anything. You know, there's folk bands that have been described as progressive, you know. And so we start with this idea of being progressive. Of course, all these bands, they start to now push the boundaries, and that creates a body of work in the early 70s which is absolutely sublime. This is the foxtrots, the close to the edges. This is the thick as a bricks, the dark side of the moons. You know, and around about 72 and 73, there's a raft of absolutely incredible albums. There's loads of them. 72 and 73, you could just pick one classic prog album after the other. This is the golden age of prog, and that's where these two ideas of progressive rock as a genre and progressive rock as an idea are completely married. Now, one of the things that colours this for us is in music criticism, back in the late 70s, the music critics sort of turned around and went, oh God, all that stuff there, that was all a bit naff really, wasn't it? You know, the Beatles and Velvet Underground, that's all brilliant, you know, that's all brilliant stuff, and they were really pushing the boundaries. But this stuff here, a little bit too intellectual, you know, a little bit too middle class, perhaps, bit, you know, college educated, but we don't want to trust this. And so part of my mission on these videos was to show that that's not the case, all right? And so the first thing I want to get across is I think that those 71, 72, 73 albums, they're absolute, some of the greatest albums produced by rock stroke popular music in the 20th century. This is a high point and we need to celebrate this. Around about 74, 75, all right, there are still masterpiece prog albums coming out. But if you look deeply into this, right, and don't just have a knee-jerk reaction of going, what about Relayer? That was made in 1974. That's a classic program. Yes, it is, right? But be subtle here. Think more subtly, right? Even if we take Relayer or Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, both of those bands are trying to change what they do. With Relayer, there's a lot more improvisation. It's a lot harsher. It's a lot noisier, right, than what Yes have done before. They are questioning what they are doing. They are progressing. With Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, they've taken in a lot of American influences onto that album, a lot of sort of soul, rhythm and blues influences on that album. It's gutsier and rootsier. And also, and people, you know, really tried to say 74, 75, there's all these brilliant classic prog albums, and they would list stuff by very, very obscure bands that are nowhere near in the same bracket as a Dark Side of the Moon or Close to the Edge. Albums that sold a few thousand copies, you know. So I stand by what I said. It actually made me feel that I was more right than I was before. And this was basically, you know, prog fans not thinking outside the box and just knee-jerk reaction to wanting to be able to say there's classic rock albums every single year. There is a difference. The other point I was trying to make is that if we take Pink Floyd as a sort of touchstone. So I keep going back to Pink Floyd right until 87. I keep going back and say, what Pink Floyd doing now? So in 66, 67, they are pioneering prog. They're one of the future prog bands. You know, by 1970, after Heart Mother, they are in there before anyone else, pushing the boundary out. One of the first sidelong epics, one of the first this. And people went, what about Tarkus? That was really great. Now, yes. You're getting confused here. Right, look at what Pink Floyd do and step back and try and see the point I'm making. You know, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, incredibly progressive, future-looking. Right, Atom Heart Mother, a mainstream rock band, highly experimental, being able to push the boundaries. Dark Side of the Moon, utter classic prog at its high point. Wish You Were Here, prog, looking backwards, lamenting the past. Right. That's an arc of the classic prog period, all right? I believe that the prog musicians, you know, by the mid-70s, were questioning the style themselves. And the threats were as much coming from disco and popular music and other forms as much as it was coming from punk. I don't think what the punks did really influenced prog that much. I'm sure the musicians would have checked them out and go, oh, this is interesting, or, you know, but I don't think that was the commercial constraints, because we can see the change happening before. And what seems to happen is, I think because of the influence of actually popular music and the shift of the audience to not wanting to stay in and get stoned and listen to Dark Side of the Moon, but wanting to go out and dance, and that shift, which happens a lot in popular music, is the progressive rock bands draw themselves in. They draw themselves in a little. And actually what we see straight after the mid-70s is a resurgence of prog, you know, and I tried to list all these albums, you know, like things like Pink Floyd, The Wall, things like Going for the One by Yes, War of the Worlds. Now, this is a mistake I made. Here in the UK, War of the Worlds was an absolutely huge album. It was into the top of the album charts. The single went to the top of the singles charts, and it's ended up selling 15 million copies. It was a huge cultural thing. In America, I don't think people knew that album. But there's many examples of this. So an example in America would be Bat Out of Hell by Meatloaf, which I think is 77, 78. That is out and out prog, but it's prog drawn in. All right. So we see the drawing in of prog, and prog then seems to create, by the late 70s, these absolutely huge albums. You know, Kate Bush, Genesis, Yes, Pink Floyd, all having the biggest albums of their career by the late 70s, and this undoes the narrative. As we go into the 80s, I think the story that came out for me there is that as you go into the 80s, prog, the influence of prog is fracturing. We still have that progressive element. We still have the idea of pushing the boundaries, you know. But as prog draws itself in, musicians are thinking, well, how do I take these influences and how do I integrate them in the music I'm doing? That could be underground indie music, that could be metal with bands like Iron Maiden, it could be popular music. And we see a shattering of prog ideas. There's far more progressive rock ideas in 80s pop music than there is punk. All right? There is a ton of disco in 80s pop music, and those are the two things for me, you know, dance music, pop music, you know, catchy, hooky, disco-y pop music, and prog, and you put those two together and you sort of get like Tears for Fears, or It Bites, or you get a whole host of, you know, you get Hounds of Love, you get Talk Talk, you know, you get that thing in popular music in the 80s. But also what's really interesting is we see the beginnings of what we know as neo-prog, which are the bands I'm attached to, which would be IQ, Marillion, 12th Night, Pendragon, Palace. And someone put up a comment where they called that retro prog. Well, I think that's unfair to the original neo-prog bands, even very unfair to Marillion, because I think they had shifted the progressive rock genre forward. I think the subject matter's darker. I think they're using much more sort of 80s popular music production techniques. And most important, they actually bring this idea of love, right, as a theme. You know, this standard pop music theme which disappears. That's brought more into the subject matter. And there's a lot less talk about, you know, wizards and sci-fi and fantasy. But without a doubt, we get this idea in the 80s of retro prog. It's not quite there. It's very hard to find a band like the Flower Kings or Spock's Beard, which is really, you know, a band that's totally, you know, creating music which is relating directly back to the 70s. It's very hard, but we start to see that as we go into the 90s, and that is the theme that came out for me in the 90s, was this idea that we now have retro prog. And I pointed to Echolin as an example of that, and I really like Echolin. I think they're great. But also the pop music that had been sort of expanded by progressive rock ideas in the 80s, all that then draws in at the end of the 80s, and we get the beginning of house music, which then goes into jungle and drum and bass. Hip hop gets more serious and visceral. Rock music turns into not only grunge but funk metal, and there's a drawing in, and that's a very exciting time. And straight after that, in the 90s, you have what I would class as the second progressive rock age. And this doesn't get counted by the proggers out there. And that would be the music that comes in with Massive Attack, Portishead, Goldie, The Orb, Future Sound of London, Aphex Twin, Autechre, Ronnie Size, Square Pusher, Lamb. I'm trying to list them all, and I only picked a few of them. But in the 90s, there's a very popular albums that are selling a lot of records which are prog, but it's a different type of prog. So we have two things. We now have retro prog and actual prog, right? Now I'm covering what I'm calling actual prog, and that's probably upsetting the proggers because they want me to cover the retro prog that has emerged. So there's many people going, why didn't you cover this? Why didn't you cover that? You know. When we get into the 2000s, the new thing there is the advent of the internet, because that affects all the music industry. Digital technologies not only affects the way you can make music, but it affects how you can distribute music. And I think progressive rock being allied to technology as it has done, and the preponderance of people who work in IT with an interest in progressive rock, you know, those sort of people, those prog bands were the first to really, you know, capitalize on that. And Marillion, you know, led the way in terms of getting the fans to fund their albums, self-releasing, you know, going through the internet. That is Marillion's great gift, I suppose, or innovation, I think, to all popular music. IQ, the band that I was in, they got out their major deal by the end of the 80s, and they set up their own release company, set up GP Records, started to self-release. And this is because they now can make the albums cheaper because of digital recording technology, and they can produce CDs and they can distribute them. As we go forward, that becomes more and more important, and it allows retro prog to flourish. And so I tried to cover that, but also showing how real progressive rock, that I'm going to call it, and people will hate me for calling this, had ended up with an album like, OK Computer, which is really the close to the edge of the 90s. And then we'd had the Kid A, which is like the relayer, right? And so, and those things are intertwining as well, and they're coming back on each other. But the thing about the 2000s that was really important, as I called it, prog.com, is the influence of digital technologies, okay? As we go into recent times now, what we see is a vast array of music which we can call progressive rock. It embraces progressive metal, gens, math rock. There's the retro prog, there's the prog fusion, there's hip-hop artists that are pushing the envelope, there's dance artists that are pushing the envelope. And I tried to, in the 2000s, show that broad expanse, which does have retro prog on the one end and has these progressive elements at the other end. So now, let's go back to, the last few minutes of this video, because I want to keep this short. Let's now go back to what I started with, is my definition of prog. The proggers loved the fact that I come up with the progometer, a way of determining how prog something was. Now, I did that originally as a little bit of a satire. Prog fans do tend to be on a certain side of the anal retentive-ometer. They do like their boundaries. They do like things ordered. Prog is about order. That's the whole point. Rock and roll is about chaos. It's about the visceral feeling of being alive. It's about the Dionysian. Prog comes in and brings the Apollonian in. And that's great, and I like that. But of course it attracts that need for order, need to be able to just say something is progressive and say that something isn't. And I was sort of slightly lampooning that by going, now I can now measure and tell you how prog Pink Floyd is, or tell you how prog Kendrick Lamar is. And I enjoyed being able to wield that, really to point out how silly that is as an idea, really. What we have, to put it simply, when we step back and look at the history of progressive rock, what progressive rock does is two things. It shows you how to take the genre you are in and expand on that, which creates new forms that will create new genres, right? It's not in the business of genre. It's a business of taking the genre and turning it inside out. That is the idea of progressive. Many people who watch this channel are artists, musicians. They probably find that very, very exciting. There is also, and it's equally valid, and I don't want to knock it, there is also the genre that's been created in the early 70s, that golden age when bands were creating incredible music that's touched us all, right? That golden age, people still want to hear people explore that genre. They still want to hear that modern take, and that's not a bad thing to do. It's the same thing as wanting to make a reggae album or ska album or a house music album. It's the same thing. I like the sounds of that, but of course, as soon as you do that, you are totally not being progressive, and that's the big schism that we've ended up within this genre. But if you follow my history through, when you're looking at bands like Polyphia, when you're looking at bands like Tortoise, when you're looking at bands like Black Midi, right, which are at the one end, they're progressive artists who are pushing the boundaries, right? Those bands, actually, you can see a graduation all the way through. And my conclusion is, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but what the progressive rock world needs to do is realise its own need for orderliness and boundaries and borders, and it needs to be aware that that is not necessarily a good thing. Relax it and be able to take in the fact that this genre has actually created a vast amount of the greatest music on the planet right now, and be able to just open its arms to that and see that it is a graduation, not a border, right? And what's interesting, I think we as a culture need to do that as well. So, you know, that seems to be the overriding thing. So anyway, I want to keep this video short, 20 minutes. That's my conclusion that I've come to from doing my huge history of progressive rock. And so if you didn't want to watch all that and just want to see what I sort of basically said over about 4 hours, then you can watch this video and you've now got that. And if you like that, then, you know, press the like button, and please, if you want to see some more, subscribe. If you want to support what I'm doing, there's a Patreon link down there. What else? If you want to know more, see the next video that's coming out, press the notification bell. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.